Well, joining me now with more on this is the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, Kevin Courtney. Thanks very much for joining us. Is there any hope at all with this meeting that's due with the government later today that these strikes could be called off?
Well, we will go in with that hope that there is some suggestion from the Secretary of State about how to resolve the dispute between us. Frankly, we're not that hopeful that she's going to say anything very useful to us, but we'll go in with that with hope in mind.
Can you just spell out for us exactly what you are asking for?
Well, we're motivated by the continuing disruption in our schools, special needs support assistants, leaving schools to go and work in supermarkets, therefore not working with children with special needs, GCSE chemistry classes which don't have chemistry teachers, primary classes where there's a succession of temporary teachers because they can't hold on to permanent staff. So we are asking for a pay rise that will put right or help to put right the teacher recruitment and retention difficulty. And the figures that we're talking about is making sure that teacher pay doesn't carry on falling year after year, which is what it's done since 2010. So we're asking for a pay rise which at least matches inflation.
So what number are you putting on that? Because obviously inflation is moving still.
Yeah, we negotiate year by year. So we're talking about the pay year that started in September last year, when experienced teachers got a 5% pay rise and inflation on RPI, which is the figure we use, was 12.3%. So the gap between those two numbers is 7.3%.
And if the government refuses to budge, they've held a pretty firm line amidst many other public pay sector demands. Do you anticipate continued strikes? Because that's what parents and families are looking at the moment.
Well, we don't even want to strike on Wednesday. We've outlined a programme of 7 days of strike action, although any particular school only affected by 4 of them between now and Easter. In England, the next day of strike action is not until February the 28th. So there is a lot of time between the 1st of February and the 28th of February to resolve this dispute. I do think the government is going to have to look at these disputes in the round, in education and in health and elsewhere, because the argument is the same. They aren't paying nurses enough, and that's why there are huge numbers of vacancies amongst nurses, and that's why there are delays to operations. It's very foolish in the long term that the disruption to the health service every day means there are people not at work who could be at work. The disruption to education means we're not training the artists, the singers, the musicians, the technicians, the scientists of the future that the country needs. Our government needs to start investing in public service and the people who work in it.
Does Jillian Keegan have the power to make the decision, or does this really need, the Prime Minister to engage with this directly?
Well, we need Jillian Keegan as the lead minister for education to speak up for education. But it's certainly true that the Prime Minister and the Treasury are going to have to be involved in settling these disputes. At the moment, though, Jillian Keegan says things to us like every area of industry has got recruitment difficulties. And for us, that's not the thing that the person in charge of education should be saying. They should be saying, I've got a real problem in education. I want schools and colleges to be properly staffed, and that means that we have to invest in the people who work in them. When we meet with her this afternoon, we're going to point out figures from bodies that aren't unions that show comparisons between teacher pay and other pay, and teacher pay falling faster than many other places in the economy. And that's a material factor in why we can't recruit and retain enough staff in our schools.
Families might sympathise with what you're saying, and many other people facing similar challenges, and yet we all know that there is this inflation problem. The government has to find taxpayers' money from somewhere if it's going to, acquiesce to these sorts of requests, and that then potentially increases the tax burden, and there's a worry about it fueling inflation too. So families might say, look, we understand it's really difficult, but we don't necessarily think strikes are the right way forward.
We know from opinion polling that a majority of parents are supporting the NEU and the action it's taking. And then we know there's a middle ground where people support the need to have investment in our schools, but don't necessarily support the strikes. So we're fairly confident at the moment that we have a good degree of parental support because we're talking about the future of education.
But what do you say to children, teenagers facing public exams this year, preparing for those? These can be incredibly crucial days of learning that they're missing, given they've missed so much during the pandemic. And they might say, look, this just is not fair. You're putting yourselves before our future.
I mean, we really don't think we're doing that. What we see coming out of COVID is continuing disruption every day. I mean, the government appointed Kevin Collins as the recovery czar to tell them how to cope with COVID. He came up with a programme costing £14 billion. The government refused it. And for that reason, amongst other reasons, there's disruption every day. And there are children preparing for their GCSEs who don't have a subject teacher qualified in the subject that they're preparing for their GCSE in. So the disruption is there every day.
Okay. Can I just ask you, I mean, it's so difficult. We all know that in the public sector it's been very, very tough. But what could Jillian Keegan realistically say to you at 2:00 today that would make you call these strikes off? That's what people will be asking right now, because 7% is a big gap. You're asking for around 12%. The offer at the moment is 5%. Would you go somewhere halfway between that, or what's the sort of bare minimum the government could offer you to call this Wednesday strike off?
Well, we're going into a discussion. We'd like it to be a negotiation. In a negotiation, you start with a position and you see where the discussion takes you. But Jillian Keegan, at the minimum, needs to say there is money, that there is new money to be used for this. Schools can't afford pay rises from within their existing resources. And if they have to make a pay rise without having money, then support assistants get sacked. So the minimum is that she has to say there is some money that we can use to invest in our children's education and the people who teach our children.
Kevin Courtney, Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, thanks very much indeed. And hopefully we'll be in touch with you a bit later today after those talks. Thank you.